Hello there, I'm Nicole Wilbur. I'm a writer and story nerd, and welcome back to my channel. Today we are talking about the middle, which is very, relevant since I am in the middle of moving, which is great. Anyways, so why are we talking about the middle of your novel? Well, I have read a lot of craft books recently and a lot on story structure, including Save the Cat writes a novel, but also Story Engineering, Anatomy of Story, and numerous other ones. As much of the craft books are helpful, they really kind of don't give much on the middle. Like, what does Save the Cat tell us? Well, we break into two right after Act 1. Act 1 we set up, lots of beats, great. Break into 2, the hero decides to leave their comfort zone, they enter the special world, and then we get to the fun and games section. And to summarize, what they describe the fun and games section to be, it's approximately, like 40% of the story. It's the hero in their new world. They're either loving it or hating it, succeeding or floundering, and it's the promise of the premise. Then there's the midpoint, which is the fun and games culminates in a false victory or false defeat, which raises the stakes. And then finally, there's the bad guys close in, which is another like 30% of the novel, where it says things get progressively worse or progressively better. So you know how to write the middle of your novel now, right? I'm not saying that these books are bad. In fact, they are very, very helpful. But a lot of us still get stuck in the middle. So, as I've been trying to write my own middle, I've come up with a few things in 1837, the first draft, and the second draft, which I'm writing right now, as well as in my project musical that I wrote last year, in combination with some insights from Anatomy of Story, into things that you can do in the middle to kind of help unmuddy blur it. First thing that I have used in order to structure my middle is what I call many plans. Break into 2, the protagonist has gotten to the new world and they have a better idea of what their problem is. So when you're faced with a problem, what does a good old protagonist do? They come up with an initial plan or strategy to deal with that situation. It could be something as simple as a line of dialogue they say to another character, right? So an example of a plan. In Chamber of Secrets, Harry hears the disembodied voice and he decides to follow it. In Anne of Green Gables, Anne reacts to Gilbert Blythe calling her carrots by whacking him with her slate. In Narnia, Break into 2, the Pevensies just got there, they had a snowball fight. They saw that Mr. Fawn, what's his name? Thomas, something like that, is gone. They don't know what to do, and then the beaver shows up, and they decide to follow the beaver. Usually, this initial plan or strategy will fail. It doesn't have to. I mean, the Pevensies were good call on following the beavers. It didn't quite go the way they thought it would, though. And the reason it usually fails is because of the character's flaw. Whether that flaw is they're selfish, they're mean, they don't know how to ride a bike properly, or they just don't know the rules of the new world. So for example, Harry is accused of petrifying a cat when he follows the disembodied voice to find the cat. Anne gets in trouble when she hits Gilbert Blythe with her slate and she makes an enemy, demonstrating her temper. And Edmund leaves the beavers without them noticing, and the beavers tell the Pevensies that they are there to save the world. And the Pevensies are like, what? We did not sign up for this. Right, and so then my next thing is, okay, I have them try, it's an initial plan, it's a short plan, like small beat, you know, and that doesn't work. So then they change their strategy a little bit and they try another plan. For example, Harry, Ron, and Hermione decide to brew Polyjuice Potion to sneak into the common room and talk to Draco. And the Pevensies decide to go after Edmund, and then they're almost eaten by wolves. So the thing that I find most helpful in these plans is how having the plan concept can really help me with the character development. So when I'm creating these plans for the characters, or when the characters are creating their own plans, I'm careful to exploit the character's flaw. Right, so let's say we have a character who lies all the time. As a very simple example. They break into 2, entering their special world, which could be the magical school of Hogwarts, or it could be Narnia, or it could be as simple as a new project at work. And their initial plan, this person who lies a lot, is to fall back and lie, because they lie a lot. right? So maybe the lying doesn't solve the problem, so they come up with a more elaborate scheme of lies. And they use that to solve their problem. And then at the midpoint, the lies blow up in their face. And they gotta change their strategy, and they have to learn to try something else. And that's just one way to structure it, right? You don't have to have the flaw blow up at the midpoint. Anatomy of Story talks about the character's moral weakness getting worse and worse and worse, kind of till that all is lost moment at the part between well, depending on how you structure your acts, either Act 2 and 3 or Act 3 and 4. You could also have the plan work. Honestly, you could have the plan work and then have the plan work really well. Things are going great, but ultimately it's leading to the protagonist down a path that's not so great. A good example of this is Devil Wears Prada. The character Andy, she starts off being very apathetic about the sort of fashion world, and she considers herself really above it. Then around the midpoint, she kind of changes and she goes too far in the other direction. So she learns how to work well in the new world, which is good, but then she's working all these long hours, she's screwing other people over, she's really become a person she doesn't recognize, and she ultimately wrecks her life pretty much, where it blows up, and it all blows up at the climax of the movie and of the book, which is really like partway through Act 3 or Act 4, depending on what structure you're talking about. So there are dozens of iterations of this, and you can figure out the best way for it to shape your character's story arc, but thinking in terms of plans really, really helps me, because it gets me thinking like, okay, I know my character, I know their flaws, what would they do first? Okay, does that fail? Does that succeed? If it fails, what would they try next? If it succeeds, what's the next obstacle they find, and then what's their next plan? Just popping in to say, if you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps me, and I really appreciate it. All right, let's go in for number 2. The second thing that's a major source of scenes and what I should do in the fun and games section is a thing I call set that shit up. Set that shit up, set stuff up. So there's a few questions that I like to think of here. So like, what are my information plots and what subtle clues do I need to leave about them? Right, so if we think of Chamber of Secrets again, which apparently my go-to right now, Harry discovers the Riddle's diary. He sees how it works, he doesn't know Ginny's involved at all. There's a scene where Ginny sees the diary, and then there's a scene where the diary is stolen. And this took up a bulk of the middle of the story, and it wasn't part of Harry's plans at all. It was just kind of like thrown in his path, and he kind of interacted with it, then lost it. He didn't really think that much of it. But that takes up a big chunk of the middle, and that provides a huge clue to this information plot. Another one, another question to ask in terms of setting stuff up. What elements are going to come together at the end of the story to bring us to our conclusion? And I want to make sure that these are all introduced. So for example, Aslan's going to be a big part of the ending in Narnia. So there's a big long section where he's spoken about. We also see a lot of those setting shit up scenes in heist stories where we get all of the clues we need for the heist to unfold in the fun and games section. And we have some submissions, we have them casing the joint that they're going to do the heist at, we have them, you know, going and procuring the elusive tool that they need in order to break in. It's a great time. And then the actual heist generally starts somewhere between the midpoint and Act 3 or Act 4. Another question that I ask myself, and the third question I ask myself in setting stuff up, is how are the relationships advancing in terms of subplots or sub-stories? So for example, in Anne of Green Gables, Gilbert is a side relationship to the story of Anne's growing up. Give those side characters a moment, you know, like give them some development. Like maybe Neville is gonna come out and cut the head off Nagini. So you wanna give him a moment in book 5 where he manages to produce a Patronus or something like that, you know what I mean? So giving those side characters, those like meaty, juicy moments that we love so much, and ensuring that those relationships, which I really think are one of the reasons I love to read stories, giving those relationships some time to develop for the readers and on the page. Obviously, ideally, these relationships would also advance the plot. Is a beat in Anatomy of Story called Attack by Ally, which I adore. That's one of my favorite beats. I think it's great because the character is off doing their flaw. They are making things, they're making a mess of things, and their relationship in their life, like their best friend or whoever comes over and is like, why are you doing this? This is not a good idea. And then there's not only tension and conflict with regards to what they're doing in the plot, but there's also tension and conflict around the relationship. So that's a great beat. I love also shows of loyalty, right? So kind of the opposite of an attack by ally, you want to have a friend or someone do a show of loyalty, a show of support for that character. Maybe they can think back to that and then in the climax remember it and trust people now. You know what I mean? Just those small little moments help with the character development of your main character and all of the others. Things like mom smoothing the protagonist's hair, jokes between the hero and their sidekick. You can really use the middle to put some of those juicy little details in. And then the third thing I like to talk about, or I like to use in the middle build to fill the space, are revelations. So what a lot of us newer writers mess up is something called info dumping, right? At the beginning of your book, you give too much information all at once in a very boring way. And this is usually way too close to the start of the novel. The reason info dumping is bad is because it feels unnatural and it's a lot for the reader to take in at once, right? So it can become boring, even if it's really cool information, and they'll also forget a lot of it because it's not tied to anything. You know, there's that saying that like you remember information and events when they're tied to emotions better. So what I try to do is focus a little bit more on establishing character, stakes, in a basic setting in the beginning, and then bringing some of that info dumping that I might have wanted to do at the beginning into the middle. Info dump is too much exposition. How we change exposition from an info dump to a revelation is when at the moment the reader and the character gets that information, it has real consequences for the story. Usually this means the revelation, the exposition, is followed by a reaction from a character and then an action from that character or a change in the plan. In Divergent, Triss, her break into two is she chooses to go into Dauntless, she does the big jump across the train, she's in the building, and then she finds out that if you fall in the bottom however many during this initiation, you will become factionless. Now, we could have had that information at the very, very beginning when she was choosing a faction, and she could have been like, oh, should I join this? I can become factionless, blah, blah, blah. But because she finds out about it in the middle, when she's in the midst of the fun and games and she literally can't leave, she's past break into two, that way raises our stakes, and that is exposition as ammunition. In Shadow and Bone, Alina learns about the amplifiers and the stag that could act as hers when she is already at the palace. It's very possible that in that beginning setup or whatever, in the information and exposition about Grisha, they could have been like, yes, and some Grisha have amplifiers, and there's this mystical stag, blah, blah, blah. But instead, she finds out about it in the middle, after she's broken into two, when she's getting used to the new world, because that is when it's more relevant to her, and that raises the stakes, right? So there's definitely overlap between these areas, but when I'm trying to figure out how the middle should be structured, I do like to think of these three things. Many, many plans, set the shit up, and revelations. So I would love to hear what you think. What kind of scenes do you put in your middle build to ensure that the reader stays engaged and to fill all of that space that you have in there and make it, not just fill it, but actually make it meaningful to the overall story? Thank you so much for watching. If you're not subscribed, think about doing that. I would really appreciate it, and I will see you next time.